A millionaire kicks out his wife for being infertile, blaming her for ruining his legacy. But years later, he spots her at a small-town fair, surrounded by 5 kids who look exactly like him. His world shatters as he realizes something doesn't add up. Could the woman he discarded be hiding a truth that changes everything? And what happens when the past he buried comes back, with 5 little faces staring right at him? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The antiseptic smell hit Celia first. Then the beeping, steady, mechanical, intrusive. Her eyelids felt like they'd been weighted down, and her mouth was cotton dry. She tried to swallow, but winced at the scrape in her throat. Hospital. She was in the hospital. The surgery. The last thing she remembered was the anesthesiologist's kind eyes above his mask, telling her to count backward from 10. She'd only made it to 8. Celia blinked, the room slowly coming into focus. Sterile white walls, the IV stand beside her, and a figure in the corner. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in what she knew without fully seeing was a $3,000 suit. Thaddeus. "You're awake." His voice carried none of the relief or tenderness one might expect from a husband at his wife's bedside. Instead, it was the same tone he used in boardrooms, detached, efficient, final. "Thaddeus." Her voice cracked. "Water?" He didn't move toward the pitcher on her bedside table. Instead, he straightened his already straight tie and took 3 measured steps toward her bed. "The procedure was successful," he said, as if reporting quarterly earnings. "No complications." Celia nodded weakly, her hand fumbling for the bed controls. She needed to sit up, to face whatever this was. Because something was wrong, terribly wrong. She could feel it in the air between them, heavy and cold. "I've brought some papers that need your signature." Thaddeus placed a leather portfolio on the bed beside her hip. His wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as he did, a cruel reminder of promises made. "Papers?" Celia managed to raise the head of her bed, wincing at the pull of stitches. "What papers?" Thaddeus opened the portfolio with manicured fingers. "Divorce papers." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Celia's heart monitor betrayed her, its steady rhythm faltering, speeding up. "Divorce?" The word felt foreign on her tongue. "Thaddeus, I don't understand. I just had surgery to help us have a baby." His jaw tightened. "A surgery that confirmed what we've suspected for 3 years. You can't have children, Celia." The cruelty of his timing made her physically recoil. "The doctor said there are other options. We could still—" "No." The single syllable sliced through her sentence. "I've given you 3 years to solve this problem. 3 years of specialists and treatments and disappointments. I'm 42 years old. I don't have time to waste on maybes and might-bes." Tears burned behind Celia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Not now. "Your infertility has robbed me of my legacy," he continued, his voice as cold as the metal railings of her hospital bed. "The Whitmore name dies with me unless I act now." A memory flashed unbidden. Thaddeus laughing as he twirled her around their kitchen the night he proposed. His eyes soft with love as he whispered, "You're all the legacy I need." What had happened to that man? "I've been more than patient," he said, extending an expensive fountain pen toward her. "My lawyers have ensured you'll be comfortable. The settlement is generous." Celia stared at the pen, then at the stranger wearing her husband's face. "You're serving me divorce papers while I'm still in a hospital gown? With anesthesia still in my system?" Something flickered across his face. Discomfort, perhaps, but not remorse. "I see no reason to delay the inevitable. Sign the papers, Celia." Her fingers trembled as she took the pen. Not from weakness or medication, but from a surge of something else, a quiet, burning rage that this man, who had vowed to love her in sickness and in health, would discard her like a failing investment. She thought of their wedding day, the honeymoon in Santorini, lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and crosswords, the night they'd painted their future nursery, speculating about whose eyes their child might have. All lies, or perhaps truths that had expired. Without a word, Celia signed her name on each flagged line. Her signature grew steadier with each page, as if each stroke of the pen was burning away something inside her. Illusion, perhaps, or love. When she finished, Thaddeus collected the papers with business-like efficiency, not meeting her eyes. "My driver will take you to the Mayfield Hotel once you're discharged. Your things are being packed. The house keys and cards need to be returned by the end of the week." Celia looked at him, really looked at him, for what she knew would be the last time. The man she had loved for 8 years, the man she had planned to grow old with. "Goodbye, Thaddeus," she said quietly. He nodded once, turned, and walked out without looking back, taking with him the future she had believed in with her whole heart. Celia watched the rain through the window of her small apartment, the gentle patter matching the rhythm of her thoughts. 6 months had passed since she'd left Meridian Heights. 6 months of rebuilding her life in the quiet coastal town of Newport Cove, where no one knew her as the ex-wife of real estate tycoon Thaddeus Whitmore. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, savoring the warmth of her tea. Her new life was modest, a far cry from the luxury she'd known. She'd taken a job at the local bookstore 3 days a week and picked up evening shifts at a cafe. The work was honest, and it kept her mind occupied during the daylight hours. At night, though, when the world grew quiet, her thoughts would drift to what might have been. Not to Thaddeus, that wound was slowly scabbing over, but to the children she'd imagined holding, the family she'd dreamed of building. The television hummed softly in the background, a mindless cooking show that required no emotional investment, until the commercial break. "Whitmore Developments announces groundbreaking new project," the announcer's voice boomed. And there they were, Thaddeus and his new wife, Lorena, cutting a ribbon with oversized scissors, her diamond ring catching the flash of cameras. Celia's hand trembled slightly, tea sloshing against the rim of her mug. 3 months. It had taken him just 3 months to replace her. Lorena was everything Celia wasn't. Tall, statuesque, with the polished gleam of old money and social connections. Her smile was dazzling as she stood beside Thaddeus, her hand possessively on his arm. "Perfect match," Celia murmured, switching off the television. She didn't need to see more. "Darling, do we really need to attend the Carmichael Gala?" Lorena's voice drifted from her dressing room, where she was trying on her 3rd outfit of the evening. "It's going to be dreadfully dull." Thaddeus adjusted his cufflinks, irritation tightening his jaw. "The Carmichaels are key investors in the Westridge project, so yes, we need to attend." Lorena emerged in a red dress that left little to the imagination, her lips painted to match. "Fine, but I won't stay past 11. I promised Alessandra we'd meet at Vantage for drinks." "We discussed this," Thaddeus said, his voice low with controlled frustration. "We're trying to present ourselves as a stable, family-oriented couple. Clubbing with your friends until dawn doesn't align with that image." She rolled her eyes, reaching for her clutch. "I didn't realize marriage to you meant retirement from living." "It means partnership," he countered. "Building something together, including the family we discussed before the wedding." Lorena's face hardened. "We discussed many things, darling, like the penthouse in Manhattan you promised, which seems perpetually in negotiations." "The timing isn't right for New York expansion," Thaddeus said automatically. It was an old argument. "And the timing isn't right for me to become a baby factory," she shot back. "I'm 29, Thaddeus. There's plenty of time for children later." He watched her apply another coat of lipstick, feeling a familiar emptiness expand in his chest. This marriage, his second attempt at creating the family legacy he craved, was already showing fractures that no public appearance could disguise. The next day, Dr. Eleanor Chen's office was warm and inviting, nothing like the clinical sterility Celia had endured during her years of fertility treatments with Thaddeus. "The tests are all positive," Dr. Chen said, her gentle smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "You're an excellent candidate for this procedure, Ms. Whitmore." Celia nodded, her heart racing with both fear and hope. "And the samples? They're viable." "Yes. The sperm samples you had stored at Manhattan Fertility Clinic were transferred successfully and remain viable. You made a wise decision to maintain storage rights during your divorce. A decision Thaddeus likely never considered when his lawyers drafted those hasty divorce papers. In his rush to discard her, he'd overlooked the biological material they'd banked years ago, when they'd first started trying, when hope was still fresh. "And everything will remain confidential?" Celia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen nodded. "Doctor-patient confidentiality is absolute. The paperwork is in order. You have full legal rights to use these samples. No one needs to know the identity of the donor unless you choose to disclose it." Celia took a deep breath. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. Of her dreams, her future, her right to motherhood. "Then I'd like to proceed," she said, her voice steadying with each word. "As soon as possible." As she signed the consent forms, Celia felt something unfurling inside her. Not just hope, but certainty. Whatever happened next, she was charting her own course now. Few months later, the labor room filled with the first piercing cry of new life, and Celia's exhausted face transformed with radiant joy. 5 tiny heartbeats that had accompanied her for months were now 5 perfect baby boys, each wrapped in blue blankets and placed in the special neonatal unit prepared for multiple births. "They're all healthy," the doctor announced, beaming at Celia. 5 strong boys. It's quite remarkable." Tears streamed down Celia's face as she reached out to touch the smallest of her sons, who had been briefly placed in her arms before being taken to join his brothers. "My miracles," she whispered. Her mother squeezed her hand. "You did it, sweetheart. All on your own." But Celia knew she hadn't been entirely alone. She had her mother, her friends who'd rallied around her when news of her quintuplet pregnancy spread, and the exceptional medical team that had guided her through the high-risk pregnancy. What she didn't have was a husband. And strangely, in this moment of triumph, that absence felt like freedom rather than loss. "Have you settled on names?" the nurse asked, adjusting Celia's pillows. "Yes," Celia said, her voice stronger now. "Daniel, Matthew, Joshua, Caleb, and Ethan." Names she'd chosen carefully, names that meant strength and gift and blessing. Names that carried nothing of their biological father except the invisible strands of DNA. Across town, in the sleek penthouse apartment that had never quite felt like home, Thaddeus Whitmore stared at the documents spread before him, his world collapsing in slow motion. "These are copies of text messages between your wife and her lover," the private investigator said, his voice professionally detached. "Dating back approximately 8 months, and these," he slid another folder forward, "are financial records showing funds being systematically transferred to offshore accounts." Thaddeus flipped through the pages, each one a fresh betrayal. Lorena and her lover, his former business partner no less, had been plotting not just an affair, but a calculated financial extraction. "She's been working with attorneys who specialize in high-net-worth divorces," the investigator continued. "Based on the communications we've intercepted, she's planning to file next month, after the Henderson deal closes." The Henderson deal, worth millions, timed perfectly to maximize her settlement. "There's more," the investigator said, hesitating for the first time. "Regarding your fertility issues." Thaddeus looked up sharply. What fertility issues? According to medical records we obtained, legally through the discovery process for another case, you were diagnosed with low sperm motility 3 years ago, during your first marriage. The room seemed to tilt. That's impossible. My ex-wife was the one who couldn't conceive. The investigator's expression remained neutral as he placed another document on the table. This is your medical report from Manhattan Fertility Clinic, dated 5 years ago. Your ex-wife never received these results. Thaddeus stared at the paper, the clinical language swimming before his eyes. Male factor infertility, significantly reduced chances of natural conception. Lorena knows, the investigator added quietly. She accessed your medical files 6 months ago. That's when the transfers to the offshore accounts began accelerating. The pieces fell into terrible place. Lorena had never intended to have his children. She'd discovered his secret, a secret he himself hadn't known, and decided to cash out of the marriage while maximizing her leverage. And Celia had shouldered the blame for their childlessness, had endured his disappointment, his growing resentment, his ultimate rejection, all while protecting his pride. Mr. Whitmore? The investigator's voice seemed to come from far away. Do you want to proceed with the divorce filing today, as we discussed? Thaddeus nodded mechanically, signing where indicated. When the investigator left, he remained at his desk, surrounded by evidence of Lorena's betrayal, but haunted by his own. 7 years passed, like the turning of seasons, each one blending into the next with quiet inevitability. Celia's countryside home stood nestled among sprawling oak trees, its white clapboard exterior weathered just enough to suggest comfort rather than neglect. A tire swing hung from the sturdiest branch of the largest oak, while a basketball hoop, slightly askew from countless enthusiastic dunks, adorned the driveway where 5 identical bicycles lay in various states of use. Inside, controlled chaos reigned. The kitchen island was covered with half-completed science projects, permission slips awaiting signatures, and a bowl of apples that never seemed to empty despite the constant raids by hungry 7-year-old boys. "Mom! Daniel took my controller again!" Joshua's voice rang through the house. "Did not!" "It was mine to begin with," came the identical-sounding reply. Celia looked up from the stack of student essays she was grading. After settling in the countryside, she'd found work as an English teacher at the local middle school, work that fulfilled her in ways she hadn't expected. "Boys," she called, her voice firm but never harsh. "You know the rules. 20 minutes each, then switch, and homework before any more screen time." The twins, for though they were quintuplets, she thought of them as 5 sets of twins, each boy somehow paired with another in interests and temperament, grumbled but complied. They always did. Celia had established boundaries early, knowing that raising 5 boys alone would require structure and consistency. Alone, but never lonely. That was the miracle she hadn't anticipated. Her days were full, chaotic, exhausting, sometimes overwhelming, but empty was one thing they never were. She moved to the window, watching as Matthew and Caleb kicked a soccer ball back and forth in the yard, their movements so synchronized they seemed to operate with one mind. Ethan sat cross-legged under a tree, lost in a book as usual. 5 different personalities, 5 distinct souls, but with the same dark hair that sometimes caught the light in a way that reminded her of their father. Not that they knew who he was. Not yet. Someday, when they were older, she would tell them the truth. But for now, they were simply hers. 50 miles away, in the gleaming glass tower that bore his name, Thaddeus Whitmore stared at the quarterly reports without really seeing them. At 53, his hair had grayed at the temples, and lines had etched themselves permanently around his mouth, downturned lines that spoke of scowls rather than smiles. "The Shanghai investors are waiting in the conference room, Mr. Whitmore," his assistant said from the doorway. Thaddeus nodded, straightening his tie. Another meeting, another deal, another meaningless victory in a war with no purpose. His second divorce had cost him, financially, professionally, socially. Lorena had made good on her threats, dragging his name through lengthy court proceedings that exposed not just their marital problems, but business dealings he'd preferred to keep private. He'd won, ultimately, protecting most of his fortune through prenuptial agreements and counter-litigation. But the victory had been Pyrrhic at best. The Whitmore name still commanded respect in business circles, but invitations to social events had dwindled. Former friends had chosen sides, and most hadn't chosen his. Even his younger brother, once his closest confidant, had distanced himself after Thaddeus refused to attend his nephew's christening. A slight born not of malice, but of the bone-deep exhaustion that had become his constant companion. He rose stiffly, ignoring the twinge in his lower back, a nagging pain his doctor attributed to stress, and advised him to address through lifestyle modifications. Whatever that meant, his lifestyle was his business, and his business was his life. What else was there? The answer came unbidden as he passed the sleek modern artwork that lined his office hallway. Nothing. There was nothing else. No wife waiting at home. No children's sporting events to attend. No family vacations to plan. Just the endless cycle of work, sleep, and solitary meals in restaurants where the staff knew his preferences, but not his stories. The Shanghai meeting proceeded like countless others before it. Thaddeus was impeccable as always, decisive, authoritative, brilliant in his strategic thinking. He closed the deal with terms favorable to Whitmore Enterprises, earning congratulatory handshakes from around the table. Yet as the investors filed out, chatting among themselves about dinner plans with their families, Thaddeus remained seated, suddenly unwilling to return to his empty penthouse, where silence would be his only greeting. He was a success by every measurable standard, and a failure in all the ways that had unexpectedly come to matter. One crisp afternoon, Thaddeus drummed his fingers on the leather armrest as his driver navigated the winding country roads. The Oak Ridge Mills development was a minor investment, a small shopping complex on the edge of a growing rural community. But the contractors had fallen behind schedule, and Thaddeus believed in seeing problems firsthand. "How much farther?" he asked, checking his watch. "About 10 minutes, sir," his driver replied. "Though there might be delays. Looks like there's some kind of local event happening." Thaddeus frowned as they approached the town square, now transformed into a bustling fairground. Colorful tents dotted the green, and crowds of people milled between booths selling everything from homemade jams to handcrafted furniture. "We'll have to park a few blocks away," the driver said apologetically. "The main lot is closed for the fair." "Fine," Thaddeus muttered. "I'll walk through. The development site is just on the other side. Meet me there in an hour." The fair was exactly the kind of small-town gathering Thaddeus typically avoided. Too loud, too crowded, too quaint. He moved briskly through the throngs, keeping his eyes fixed on the path ahead, ignoring the calls of vendors hawking their wares. Until laughter, bright, musical laughter, stopped him cold. He knew that laugh, had once lived for that laugh. Thaddeus turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. And there she was, standing at a cotton candy booth, sunlight catching in her hair. Celia. She looked different, her hair shorter, her face slightly fuller, but somehow more radiant than he remembered. She wore a simple sundress and practical sandals, nothing like the designer clothes he'd once insisted she wear to company events. Yet she glowed with a vitality he'd never seen during their marriage. But it wasn't Celia alone that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the children surrounding her. 5 boys, ranging from what looked like 6 to 8 years old, all with the same dark hair, the same sharp features, the same dimpled chin when they smiled. His chin. "Mom, can we get blue this time?" one of the boys asked, tugging at Celia's hand. "I want pink," another protested. "We'll get one of each and share," Celia said. her voice exactly as Thaddeus remembered it, warm, patient, firm. Thaddeus stepped behind a nearby tent, his legs suddenly unsteady. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. Yet the evidence stood before him, 5 living, breathing copies of his childhood photographs. His sons. They had to be his sons. But how? When? The divorce had been finalized years ago, shortly after Celia's miscarriage, the last in a series of failed pregnancies that had ultimately destroyed their marriage. The doctors had been clear. Celia couldn't carry a child to term. That's why he'd... Shame burned through him as he remembered his cruelty, his impatience, his blind insistence that the problem must be with her. Thaddeus watched as Celia and the boys moved away from the cotton candy stand, each child clutching a colorful cloud of spun sugar. They moved as a unit, the boys orbiting around Celia like planets around a sun, occasionally darting away to examine something interesting before returning to her side. Without conscious decision, Thaddeus followed them, keeping a careful distance. They stopped at various booths, the boys trying their hand at ring toss, Celia admiring handmade quilts, all of them pausing to pet a lamb in the small petting zoo area. One of the boys, slightly taller than the others, with a serious expression, stopped to examine a display of polished stones. The vendor, an elderly man with weathered hands, showed him how different minerals caught the light. The boy nodded with such grave attention that Thaddeus felt a jolt of recognition. He'd worn that same expression as a child, his father had always said, when learning something new. Another boy, this one with a cowlick that refused to lie flat, ran ahead to a booth selling wooden toys. His excited gestures as he showed something to his brothers mirrored exactly the way Thaddeus's own hands moved when explaining a new business concept. There was no doubt. These were his children. Somehow, impossibly, these were his sons. And he had never known they existed. Thaddeus couldn't sleep that night. The images of those 5 boys, his sons, played on an endless loop in his mind. Their laughter, their movements, their faces that were unmistakable reflections of his own childhood photos. By morning, he had made his decision. He would find out the truth, whatever it took. Over the next 2 weeks, Thaddeus deployed all the resources at his disposal. He hired private investigators, called in favors from contacts in government offices, and even tracked down old hospital staff from when Celia had been a patient. The evidence mounted, piece by puzzling piece. Birth certificates confirmed what his eyes had told him. 5 boys, born to Celia Whitmore, father listed as unknown. But it was the medical records that truly shook him. Records that should have been impossible to obtain. Yet money and influence had their ways. Records that told a story he couldn't comprehend. The fertility clinic paperwork showed treatments beginning shortly after their divorce. Treatments using stored samples. His samples. Samples he'd provided years earlier, during their marriage, when they'd first started trying for children. Samples he'd completely forgotten about in the bitter aftermath of their split. Legally, those samples should have been destroyed after the divorce. But somehow, they hadn't been. The final piece came from a nurse who'd worked at the clinic during that time. She remembered Celia, remembered her determination, her quiet dignity, her refusal to give up on having children despite everything she'd been through. "She was the strongest woman I ever met," the nurse had said over the phone. Never complained, never blamed anyone, just kept moving forward. Thaddeus sat in his car outside a small bookstore in Celia's town, waiting. His investigators had provided her schedule. Tuesdays at 4 p.m., she visited this shop alone while the boys were at soccer practice with a neighbor. When she emerged, arms full of books, the sight of her hit him like a physical blow. She looked content in a way she never had during their marriage. Her shoulders relaxed, her step light. Before he could reconsider, Thaddeus was out of his car, crossing the street toward her. "Celia." She stopped, books clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression remained remarkably calm as she looked at him, though her knuckles whitened around her purchases. "Thaddeus." no surprise in her voice. "I wondered when you'd show up. You knew I'd find out. Eventually. This town isn't that big." Cars passed on the street beside them. A couple walked by, glancing curiously at them before continuing on. "They're mine," Thaddeus said. Not a question, but a statement. "The boys. They're my sons." Celia didn't deny it. "Biologically speaking." "How?" The word came out raw, desperate. "The doctors said you couldn't—" "The doctor said I had difficulty carrying to term," she corrected quietly. "A different issue entirely from what you assumed. But after we divorced—" "After you divorced me," she clarified. "While I was still in the hospital recovering from a miscarriage, I had time to think, to research, to find specialists who actually listened." Thaddeus flinched at the reminder of his cruelty, but pressed on. "Those samples should have been destroyed." "Perhaps, but they weren't. Why didn't you tell me? They're my children too." For the first time, a flash of anger crossed Celia's face. "Are they? You walked away from the possibility of children with me. You publicly blamed me for our childlessness. You replaced me within months with someone younger, someone you thought could give you what you wanted. I had a right to know." "Did you?" Celia shook her head. "You never cared to ask who I truly was, Thaddeus. Not once in our marriage did you see me as anything but an extension of yourself, a means to your legacy. Why would I offer you children to dismiss and damage the way you dismissed and damaged me?" The words struck Thaddeus like physical blows. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but found he had no defense to offer. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. Celia adjusted the books in her arms. "That depends on you. For the first time in your life, Thaddeus. You're not in control of the situation." She turned to walk away, then paused. "The boys have soccer practice until 5:30. I'll be at the cafe across from the field." She left him standing there, drowning in guilt and confusion, wondering how he could have been so blind for so long. Next day, Thaddeus sat motionless in the stark consultation room of Boston Medical Center, staring at the manila folder in his trembling hands. Dr. Richard Hayes, a silver-haired fertility specialist with kind eyes and a grave expression, waited patiently across the desk. "I don't understand," Thaddeus finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "These are my medical records from 15 years ago." "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, from when you and your first wife were patients here." Thaddeus flipped through the pages again, the medical terminology swimming before his eyes, but certain phrases stood out with terrible clarity. Low sperm motility, compromised morphology, significant male factor infertility. "This can't be right," he insisted, even as the truth began to settle like a stone in his stomach. Celia was the one who couldn't— His voice trailed off. Dr. Hayes removed his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore, I wasn't your physician back then, but these records are quite clear. You were the primary factor in your fertility challenges as a couple. Mrs. Whitmore had some minor issues that might have complicated matters, but nothing that should have prevented conception with healthy sperm." The room seemed to tilt. Thaddeus loosened his tie, suddenly struggling to breathe. "But we were told, I was told." "According to these notes," Dr. Hayes said gently, "your wife requested that this information be kept from you. She was concerned about how it might affect you." A memory surfaced. Celia, pale and composed after yet another appointment, squeezing his hand and saying, "We'll keep trying, Thaddeus. These things take time." Never once mentioning that he was the problem. "She knew," Thaddeus whispered. "All those years, she knew, and she never said a word." "It appears she was trying to protect you," Dr. Hayes observed. "Protect him. While he had blamed her, resented her, eventually discarded her, she had been protecting his pride." There's something else you should know, the doctor continued, pulling another file from his desk drawer. When couples undergo fertility treatment, we often preserve samples as a precaution. Thaddeus looked up sharply. What are you saying? Several samples of your sperm were frozen during your treatment period. According to our records, those samples were never destroyed after your divorce, contrary to standard protocol. The realization hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. The children, he gasped. They're actually mine. Biologically mine. Dr. Hayes nodded solemnly. I can't comment on how those samples might have been used after your divorce, but from what you've told me about these children and their resemblance to you, yes, it's entirely possible. Thaddeus recalled the faces of the 5 boys, his strong jaw in one, his eyes in another, his father's distinctive ears on a third. The evidence had been staring him in the face. There was a nurse, Thaddeus said slowly, remembering something else. Right after our divorce, she contacted me about some paperwork that needed signing. I was so angry, I just told her to handle it however she wanted. Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow. That would have been highly irregular, but it might explain how the samples remained available. Thaddeus leaned back, overwhelmed. The magnificent lie he'd built his life around crumbled to dust. He wasn't the virile, potent man he'd pretended to be. Celia wasn't the barren wife he'd rejected. And the children, the beautiful, thriving children he'd glimpsed, were undeniably his own flesh and blood. All these years, he murmured, I've been living a lie. I divorced her because I thought she couldn't give me children. I blamed her publicly, humiliated her. And all along, Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Hayes said quietly, medicine isn't perfect. Even with these challenges, natural conception was not impossible, just highly unlikely. The important question now is, what do you plan to do with this information? Thaddeus closed the folder, his mind racing. 5 children, his children, were growing up without him, raised by the woman he had wronged so terribly. A woman who, despite everything, had wanted his children badly enough to find a way to have them, even after he'd abandoned her. Thank you, Doctor, Thaddeus said, rising from his chair. You've given me a lot to think about. Thaddeus stood on the sidewalk outside Celia's modest 2-story home, a colorful bouquet clutched in one hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. The front yard was scattered with evidence of children. A bicycle tipped on its side, a basketball nestled in the flower bed, chalk drawings decorating the driveway. He had called ahead this time, no ambushes or demands, just a humble request to visit. When the door opened, it wasn't Celia, but a boy of about 7, their oldest son. The resemblance hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. The boy had his grandfather's sharp chin and Thaddeus's own serious eyes, now narrowed with suspicion. You're him, aren't you? The boy asked. The man who was here last week. Thaddeus nodded, suddenly unsure what to say to this child. His child, who was a complete stranger. I'm Thaddeus Whitmore. Your mother said I could stop by. The boy didn't move from the doorway. I know who you are. Mom told us everything. Everything. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with years of absence and abandonment. James! Celia's voice floated from inside the house. Please let Mr. Whitmore in. The boy, James, named after Thaddeus's own father, stepped aside reluctantly, his gaze never leaving Thaddeus's face. Inside, the house was warm and lived in. Photos lined the walls, tracking the growth of 5 boys from infancy to the present. Toys were stacked in baskets, school books piled on a desk. It was nothing like the pristine, showroom-perfect mansion Thaddeus maintained, and something about its cheerful chaos made his throat tighten. Celia appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked different than she had at their chance meeting. More relaxed in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. 4 more boys of varying ages clustered behind her, peering at him with undisguised curiosity. "Thank you for seeing me," Thaddeus said, extending the flowers awkwardly. Celia accepted them with a small nod. "Boys, this is Mr. Whitmore. He's an old friend of mine." "Is he our father?" asked the youngest, a small boy of about 5 who had Thaddeus's eyes exactly. The question hung in the air. Celia looked at Thaddeus, her expression guarded, but not unkind. "That's something your mother and I need to discuss," Thaddeus answered carefully. "But I would very much like to get to know all of you." James crossed his arms. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "James," Celia cautioned. "No, it's a fair question," Thaddeus said. "I didn't know about you boys until recently. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Celia turned to her sons. "Why don't you all go play in the backyard for a while? Mr. Whitmore and I need to talk." The younger boys filed out obediently, but James lingered. "We're fine without him, Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We've always been fine." "I know, sweetheart," Celia said softly. "This isn't about needing anyone. It's about understanding our past." After a long moment, James nodded and followed his brothers, though not without a final warning look at Thaddeus. Alone in the living room, Celia gestured for Thaddeus to sit. "They're protective," she explained, settling into an armchair across from him. "Especially James." "They're remarkable," Thaddeus said honestly. "You've done an amazing job with them." "Thank you." She met his gaze steadily. "Why are you here, Thaddeus?" He looked down at his hands. "I know now, about everything, that I was the one who couldn't, that you protected me from the truth, that these boys are biologically mine." "Yes," she said simply. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "What I did to you was unforgivable, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what kind of man I was, and I'm trying to be better." Something softened in Celia's expression. "We were both young," she said quietly. "You were under tremendous pressure from your family. That doesn't excuse it." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Outside, they could hear the boys laughing as they played. "They're happy," Thaddeus observed. Celia smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, they are. I remember when you used to smile like that at me," he said softly, "before I ruined everything." Celia looked at him for a long moment. "We had good times too, Thaddeus. I haven't forgotten that." Something warm and hopeful unfurled in his chest. "I don't expect to walk back into your life, into their lives, as if nothing happened. But if you're willing, I'd like the chance to know them, to make amends somehow." "I think," Celia said carefully, "that might be possible, with time." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Thaddeus glimpsed the connection they'd once shared, damaged but not entirely destroyed. The afternoon sun was setting when they heard the first sirens. Celia and Thaddeus had been sitting on the back porch, watching the boys play soccer in the yard, their conversation tentative but warming with each passing hour. "What's that?" Celia stood up, frowning as she sniffed the air. Thaddeus rose beside her. "Smoke." They rushed to the front yard just as fire trucks screamed past. 2 houses down, angry orange flames licked up the side of the Peterson home, black smoke billowing into the twilight sky. "Mom!" James called, running up with his brothers. "The Peterson house is on fire!" "Stay back, all of you," Celia ordered, counting heads automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Where's Joshua?" The middle child, 10-year-old Joshua, was nowhere to be seen. "He went to return Tommy Peterson's video game," the youngest boy said, his eyes wide with fear. "Just before we started playing." Thaddeus felt his blood turn to ice. "The Peterson house? The one that's burning?" Celia's face drained of color. She bolted toward the blazing house, Thaddeus right behind her. Firefighters were already unrolling hoses, shouting orders as neighbors gathered on the street. "My son!" Celia screamed, trying to push past a firefighter. "My son is in there!" "Ma'am, you can't go in." But Thaddeus was already moving. Without hesitation, he ducked under the firefighter's arm and sprinted toward the burning house. The heat hit him like a wall as he approached the front door, which hung partially open. "Joshua!" he shouted, pulling his shirt over his mouth. "Joshua, where are you?" Smoke burned his eyes and scorched his lungs as he entered. The living room was a maze of flames, furniture already consumed by fire. He dropped to his knees, crawling beneath the worst of the smoke. "Help!" A small voice came from upstairs. "Help us!" Thaddeus fought his way to the staircase, the wood groaning under his weight. The banister was hot enough to blister his palm when he grabbed it. Upstairs, he found Joshua and his friend Tommy huddled in a bathroom, towels stuffed against the door crack. "I've got you," Thaddeus gasped, gathering Joshua into his arms. "Tommy, stay close to me." The hallway was now engulfed in flames. A beam crashed down behind them, blocking their return to the stairs. Thaddeus pulled both boys into the nearest bedroom, slamming the door shut. "The window," he coughed, pushing furniture aside. He smashed the glass with his elbow, ignoring the cuts that immediately bloomed on his skin. Outside, firefighters had spotted them. "Throw the boys down!" one shouted. "We've got a ladder coming!" Thaddeus lifted Tommy first, lowering him as far as he could before releasing him into the waiting arms below. Then Joshua. "Go," he told the boy, who suddenly clung to him. "Not without you," Joshua said, his small face streaked with soot and tears. "I'm right behind you," Thaddeus promised. As Joshua was safely caught below, the floor beneath Thaddeus gave a sickening crack. Flames shot up through new fissures in the wood. He lunged for the window just as the floor collapsed, sending him crashing down in a shower of burning debris. Pain exploded through his body. The world went dark around the edges as smoke filled his lungs. His last conscious thought was of Celia's face. Outside, Celia watched in horror as the second floor partially collapsed. "Thaddeus!" she screamed, fighting against the arms that held her back. Moments later, firefighters emerged from the inferno carrying a limp figure. Thaddeus's clothes were scorched, his face blackened with soot. An oxygen mask was immediately placed over his mouth. "Is he?" Celia couldn't finish the question. "He's alive, ma'am, but he needs a hospital now." Joshua broke away from the paramedic checking him and ran to Thaddeus's side. "He saved us," the boy sobbed. "He came back for me." In the ambulance, Celia held Thaddeus's hand, tears streaming down her face. His eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on her with effort. "The boys?" he whispered hoarsely. "Safe," she choked out. "Michael's safe. You saved him." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips before unconsciousness claimed him again. At the hospital, all 5 boys huddled in the waiting room, even James sitting silent and somber. When the doctor finally emerged, Celia rose on shaky legs. "He has second-degree burns on his arms and back, smoke inhalation, and a broken leg from the fall," the doctor explained. "But he'll recover. He was very lucky." "Can we see him?" James asked, surprising everyone. The doctor nodded. Briefly, he's sedated but stable. They filed into the room quietly. Thaddeus lay still, bandages covering much of his visible skin, an oxygen mask over his face. Celia couldn't hold back her tears at the sight of him. Joshua approached the bed first, placing a small hand on Thaddeus's uninjured arm. "Thank you," he whispered. One by one, each boy murmured thanks to the man who had risked everything to save their brother. Even James stood at the foot of the bed, his usual defiance replaced by newfound respect. Celia leaned down and gently kissed Thaddeus's forehead. "We're all here," she said softly. your family is here." For 3 weeks, Thaddeus's hospital room became a second home to Celia and the children. The boys visited in rotating shifts after school, bringing handmade cards and cautious conversation. But it was in the evenings, after the children had been tucked into bed and Lorena had taken over, that Celia would return alone. Tonight, she found him sitting up, his bandaged hands resting on the blanket. The bruising around his eyes had faded to a yellowish purple, and he'd been taken off oxygen that morning. He looked up when she entered, his face softening. "The nurse said you might be discharged next week," Celia said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "That's what they tell me." He shifted, wincing slightly. "How are the boys?" "Joshua made you another card. He's telling everyone at school how you rescued him from the fire." She placed the colorful construction paper on his bedside table. Even James asked if he could visit tomorrow. Thaddeus's eyes widened. "James did." Celia nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "You've made quite an impression." Silence settled between them, comfortable in a way that surprised them both. Outside, rain pattered against the window, turning the world beyond into a blur of streetlights and shadows. "I've been thinking a lot," Thaddeus finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "About everything, about us." Celia's hands tightened in her lap. "Thaddeus—" "Please," he interrupted gently. "I need to say this." He took a painful breath. "I was wrong, Celia. Not just about the fertility issues, about everything. I treated our marriage like a business transaction. When things didn't go according to my plan, His voice broke. "I threw away the best thing in my life." Tears welled in Celia's eyes. "We both made mistakes." "No." He shook his head firmly. "You tried. You were patient and loving, and I was too blinded by my own ego to see it. When I think about how I left you in that hospital bed—" "It was a long time ago," she whispered. "Not long enough to forget." He reached for her hand, his movements careful with the IV still attached. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Celia. But I want you to know that I understand now what I threw away. And I'm sorry. Truly sorry." For the first time in years, Celia saw the man she had fallen in love with. Not the ambitious tycoon, but the vulnerable human beneath. "I never stopped loving who you used to be," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Even when I hated what you did, some part of me remembered the man who would bring me wildflowers just because it was Tuesday. The man who held my hand through every disappointment. I lost myself somewhere along the way," he said. "Success became more important than happiness, than you. It took losing everything to realize how wrong I was." Celia wiped a tear from her cheek. "What do you want now, Thaddeus?" He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't in years. "A chance to know my children, a chance to be the father they deserve." He paused, swallowing hard. "And maybe, someday, if you could ever trust me again, a chance to show you I've changed." She studied him, searching his face for any trace of the arrogance that had driven them apart. Instead, she found only sincerity and regret. "The boys need time," she said finally, "and so do I." "I have nothing but time now," he replied. "And for once in my life, I'm willing to wait." Celia felt something shift between them, not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. She reached out and gently touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "You could have died in that fire," she whispered. "It would have been worth it," he said without hesitation. "To save our son." Our son. The words hung in the air between them, bridging years of separation. When Celia leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead, it wasn't passion that passed between them, but something deeper. A fragile, newborn trust, taking its first breath in the quiet of that hospital room. 3 months after the hospital discharge, Thaddeus stood in the empty living room of his new home, surrounded by moving boxes and bare walls. The three-bedroom house on Maple Street was modest by any standard and microscopic compared to his former penthouse. But it was only 6 blocks from Celia's place, close enough to be present, yet far enough to give her space. He ran his hand along the kitchen counter, still adjusting to the idea that this was his life now. The sale of his downtown properties and vacation homes had been finalized last week. His business associates had been shocked, but Thaddeus felt nothing but relief as he signed the papers. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. He opened it to find Celia standing on his porch with Joshua and Ethan. "We brought a housewarming gift," she said, holding out a potted plant. "It's a PC," Ethan added, his voice serious despite her 7 years. "Mom says they're hard to kill." Thaddeus laughed. "A plant that might survive my care. That's thoughtful." Joshua peered past him. "Is that all your stuff? Where's your furniture?" "It's being delivered tomorrow," Thaddeus explained, stepping aside to let them in. "I sold most of my old things. Thought I'd start fresh." Celia's eyes met his, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. She nodded slightly, approval flickering across her face. "The twins have a soccer game Saturday morning," she said. 9 o'clock at Westfield Park. They'd like you to come." Thaddeus felt a surge of hope. "I'll be there." The soccer field was muddy from overnight rain, and Thaddeus's Italian leather shoes were ruined within minutes. He didn't care. Standing on the sidelines, he cheered as James made a crucial save as goalkeeper. "He's got your reflexes," Celia commented, appearing beside him with a thermos. "And your determination," Thaddeus replied, accepting the offered coffee. After the game, he knelt down to James's level, not minding the mud staining his pants. That was some impressive goalkeeping. James, usually the most reserved around him, broke into a rare smile. "Coach says I might be team captain next season." "I'm not surprised," Thaddeus said. "I'll help you practice if you want." James studied him for a moment before nodding. "Maybe tomorrow? There's a field near your house." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. "I don't understand this," Matthew groaned, pushing her math homework away. "Mom's busy with the twins, and I have a test tomorrow." Thaddeus, who had come over for dinner, glanced at the algebra problems. "I can help. I used to be pretty good with numbers." Matthew looked skeptical but pushed the textbook toward him. "Let's see," he said, pulling up a chair. "When I was building my first property, I had to calculate costs per square foot all the time. It's not so different from what you're doing here." An hour later, Celia found them surrounded by scratch paper, Caleb nodding enthusiastically as Thaddeus explained a concept. "I get it now," Matthew exclaimed. "It's like translating English into math language." Celia leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Thaddeus caught her eye and saw something new there, a flicker of respect. The school pickup line was intimidating at first. Thaddeus felt out of place among the parents who all seemed to know each other. But he showed up every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, gradually learning the rhythm of after-school routines. "Mr. Whitmore?" The school secretary called one afternoon. "Matthew's teacher would like to speak with you." Panic seized him. "Is he okay?" "He's fine," the secretary assured him. "It's about the career day presentation." In the classroom, Matthew's teacher smiled. "Matthew has been telling everyone her father is coming to talk about architecture. He's quite excited." "His father," Thaddeus repeated, the words catching in his throat. That evening, he called Celia. Matthew's teacher mentioned career day. "I didn't want to presume." "He's been talking about it all week," Celia interrupted gently. "He wants you there." By summer, Thaddeus had established a routine: swimming lessons with the twins on Mondays, science projects with Joshua on Wednesdays, weekend trips to the museum with whoever wanted to join. He learned each child's favorite foods, their fears, their dreams. One evening, as he helped load the dishwasher after family dinner at Celia's house, he realized something had fundamentally changed. The children no longer fell silent when he entered a room. They sought him out, sharing their triumphs and disappointments. "You look happy," Celia observed, handing him a plate. "I am," he admitted, "happier than I've ever been." She smiled, and for a moment, their hands touched over a water glass. "They needed you in their lives," she said quietly. "Maybe we all did." The late August evening carried the gentle warmth of summer's end. Celia's backyard glowed with the soft light of string lights draped across the wooden pergola, casting a golden hue over the large table she had set for dinner. Potted herbs lined the edges of her patio, their fragrance mingling with the scent of grilling food. Thaddeus arrived exactly on time, a habit he'd never broken. He carried a small cooler in one hand and a bouquet of sunflowers in the other. "I brought the ice cream the kids asked for," he said, lifting the cooler slightly. "And these reminded me of you." Celia accepted the flowers with a smile that reached her eyes. "They're beautiful. Thank you." She led him to the backyard where the children were already setting the table. It struck him how seamlessly they worked together, Ethan placing napkins beside each plate, the twins arranging water glasses, Joshua carrying out a large bowl of salad with careful concentration. "Dad's here," Matthew called out, the word still new enough to make Thaddeus's heart skip. There was a time when his arrival would have created tension, but now the children simply incorporated him into their rhythm. James handed him the tongs for the grill without prompting. "Mom said you're in charge of the chicken." "A serious responsibility," Thaddeus replied with mock solemnity, making James roll his eyes but smile. As he stood at the grill, Thaddeus watched Celia move around the yard. She wore a simple sundress, her hair pulled back loosely, looking more relaxed than he could remember seeing her during their marriage. The realization carried a pang of regret, but also appreciation for who she had become. "Need any help?" she asked, approaching with a platter for the chicken. "I think I've got it under control," he replied, flipping a piece with practiced ease. "Though I never thought I'd become someone who grills." "Life takes unexpected turns," Celia said softly. Their eyes met briefly, acknowledging all that had passed between them without needing words. Dinner was a lively affair. The table buzzed with overlapping conversations, laughter, and the occasional squabble quickly resolved. Thaddeus marveled at how different this felt from the formal dinners of his past. The stiff conversations with business associates, the cold silence of his second marriage, even the tense meals with Celia toward the end of their time together. "Remember when Dad tried to make pancakes last weekend?" Joshua said, giggling as he reached for another piece of bread. "The first one looked like a monster." "But they tasted good," Thaddeus defended himself, smiling. "They were terrible," Ethan corrected, her honesty making everyone laugh. "But you got better with the last ones." "Practice makes progress," Celia said, a phrase Thaddeus had heard her repeat often to the children. "That's why Dad's helping me with my piano now," Matthew added. "I'm practicing every day." Thaddeus caught Celia's gaze across the table. There had been a time when he'd measured success in buildings acquired and deals closed. Now it was measured in these small moments: a child's improved piano skills, a successfully flipped pancake, the casual use of Dad in conversation. As they finished eating, the sky deepened to indigo. The youngest, C, who had been unusually quiet, slipped from her chair and padded around the table. Without hesitation, she climbed into Thaddeus's lap, something she'd never done before. The conversation around them continued, but Thaddeus's world narrowed to this small person settling against his chest. He carefully adjusted his arm to support her, afraid to move too much and break the spell of her trust. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. She nodded, her small hand playing with the button on his shirt. Then she looked up at him with eyes so much like his own and whispered, "I'm glad you came back." Something broke open inside Thaddeus's chest, a dam he hadn't realized was still holding back so much emotion. He swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. "I'm glad too," he finally managed, his voice rough with feeling. "So very glad." He looked up to find Celia watching them, her expression unreadable at first. Then she smiled, not the polite smile of co-parenting arrangements or the cautious smile of new beginnings, but something deeper and more genuine. Their eyes met across the table, holding a conversation without words. No grand declarations passed between them. No promises or pronouncements. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the growth, and now this moment of peace neither could have imagined possible a year ago. Later, as the children cleared the table, Thaddeus and Celia stood side by side washing dishes in the kitchen. The familiar domesticity of the task felt both strange and right. "Caleb doesn't warm up to people easily," Celia said, handing him a plate to dry. "She's our most cautious one." Thaddeus nodded, carefully wiping the dish. "I know. That's why it meant so much." "You've been consistent," she observed. "That's what they needed. What they still need." "What I should have been all along," he added quietly. Celia paused, her hands still in the soapy water. "We can't change the past, Thaddeus. But this." She gestured toward the backyard where the children were now playing an improvised game of flashlight tag, their laughter floating through the open window. "This is good." When the dishes were done, they joined the children outside. Ethan had set up the portable fire pit, and Joshua was carefully arranging graham crackers and chocolate for s'mores. "Dad, you have to try one the way I make them," James insisted, with the chocolate melted first. "That's not how you're supposed to do it," Matthew argued. "There's no wrong way," Celia interjected, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs with a contented sigh. Thaddeus took the chair beside her, acutely aware of how far they'd come. A year ago, he'd been a broken man, confronted with the consequences of his pride and the family he'd thrown away. Now he sat surrounded by the laughter and warmth of that same family, not as a husband, but as something equally important. A father, a co-parent, a person finding his way back to what truly mattered. As the fire crackled and the children debated the perfect marshmallow roasting technique, Caleb wandered over again. This time he climbed onto the wide arm of his chair, leaning trustingly against his shoulder. "Want to share my s'more?" he offered, holding out a sticky, slightly mangled creation. "I'd be honored," he replied, accepting a small bite of the treat. Across the fire, Celia watched them, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. When their eyes met this time, there was healing in the gaze they shared. Not a return to what was, but the beginning of what could be. A family reshaped by time and forgiveness, finding its way to a new kind of wholeness. No words were needed. The peace between them spoke volumes enough. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.